So, this week we're focusing on the social construction of race and ethnicity. So, one of the first readings for this week was the Peggy McIntosh piece on white privilege, unpacking the invisible knapsack. So, this piece is about her self work and the ways in which she experiences white privilege in her everyday life. So, this started out of how she thought about gender inequality and the ways in which that men were willing to recognize that women were at a disadvantage in many instances of life, but they were also at the same time hesitant to recognize that they are at some kind of an advantage. So her self-work has revolved around recognizing the privileges that she has in her everyday life as a white woman. So, if you're a white person taking this class, what are some ways that you might experience white privilege in your everyday life? Have you thought about this? Read through the list and put a check mark next to the ones that you can remember instances of or experience instances of every day. I think it's a really important activity for all of us to engage in when just thinking about our lived experiences. So a few that I thought stood out to me in particular that I want to highlight. I can speak in public to a powerful male group without putting my race on trial. 2, I am never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. And 3, if I declare there's a racial issue at hand or there isn't a racial issue at hand, my race will lend me more credibility for either position than a person of color will have. So I'm going to unpack these a little bit now that I've read them over. So in the first one, speaking in public to a powerful male group, my gender will absolutely be scrutinized, but race will not play a factor. I will automatically be given more credibility as a white person. And then the second one, I'm never asked to speak for all the people of my racial group. A lot of dominant narratives are white narratives, and so I'm never asked to represent all white people because that seems ludicrous. But oftentimes, people of color, especially if they're the only person of color in a group, they're asked constantly to speak for that whole group, and we wouldn't do that for white folks. So that sort of represents a way that my whiteness is privileging me in a lot of contexts. So if I declare there's a racial issue, my race will lend me more credibility for a position if I say that there is or isn't a racial issue at hand. So for me to raise something in a context, so like if I notice something racist happen at a meeting, if I were to say, hey, this seems like there's a race issue happening in our department meetings, I'm not okay with this is not a welcoming environment for people of color, my whiteness won't be called into question in terms of like how that matters for me seeing a race issue. Like I won't be criticized and be told that I'm being oversensitive in that particular context. And that's really important. What I find interesting is thinking about intersectionality in this particular instance. So we didn't do any readings on intersectionality, but intersectionality was a concept developed by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a woman of color and a really amazing scholar. And it basically talks about how people's unique lived experiences involve multiple intersecting identities. So someone's race, their class, their gender, their sexuality are all going to meet at intersections to create a particular lived identity experience for that person. People have sort of discussed them as being additive, so the more oppressed groups a person belongs to, the more oppressed that they are, but a lot of people sort of push back on these oversimplified additive and multiplicative notions of intersectionality, and instead we try to think about it more as just personal, unique lived experiences. That's how I like to think about it, at least. And so when I think about my intersectional position, as an openly LGBTQ person, I am white, so I'm never asked to talk as the only person for my racial group, but I am often sort of pinpointed as the person to talk about the experiences of all LGBTQ people, which obviously is is definitely not fair to all LGBTQ people. I can't speak to the experiences of a lot of people. So I'm from Massachusetts, where it was really safe for me to be open, for me to come out. But that's not the case ever in the US, but I'm still sort of looked at to have a voice for all these folks that just have such different experiences than myself. So I think there are ways that this privilege is expandable to all types of identities, and we should think about it for all types of our identities. So in what ways are we privileged in some ways but not in others, and how does that matter for our day-to-day lived experience and the access we have to institutions? So one of the other readings, it was a video for this week, was the Black Lives Matter slam poem. So there's a lot of misunderstandings about what the Black Lives movement means and what we mean when we say that Black Lives Matter. And what this poem is meant to highlight is how ludicrous it is when people come back at Black Lives Matter activists and say, well, all lives matter. Because the comparison that the poet makes is the way people react to endangered animals. So how silly does it sound when someone says pandas are endangered? We need to do something about panda bears being endangered, but what about koala bears? Koala bears aren't the issue. Koala bears aren't facing the same critical endangerment as panda bears in this example. And so that's kind of what this poem is getting at. So that to sort of really pinpoint that all lives matter isn't actually addressing the issue at hand. What we're addressing, and what the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to address, is that we have an epidemic of police violence that Black folks are facing, and that's sort of where we need to put the focus on. It's not that all other people don't matter in the world, but that's not what we're talking about. So I find that slam poetry in particular is really powerful and can be really, really helpful in helping us sort of understand different cultural and social issues. So biases might be explicit, but they're often actually implicit, which I think becomes really clear in the Steger reading. So where she's discussing how giftedness becomes equated with whiteness, this wasn't necessarily happening in an intentional and explicit way. Like, right, the magnet program was originally built to increase integration between schools so that schools were less segregated, and there were gifted programs that were accessible to students of color within this particular institution. But what it actually ended up doing was reinforcing segregation, because the students who were predominantly in the gifted, more AP classes were white students, and students of color were often still just funneled through the standard level classes. And the example she gave that I thought was particularly eye-opening was the difference in the length of instruction and how it made it actually impossible for students who were in standard classes to be taking the AP and honors classes, because the length of time for the course didn't line up. So you couldn't be in these shorter classes than these longer classes and actually fill your schedule in a way that was appropriate. And there was also that discourse too around protecting the gifted students. And while I'm sure that they didn't mean it in necessarily a racist way, it is implicitly racist to say, oh, well, we need to protect these students. And right, in one of those examples, they were protecting one of the gifted Black students, but that student still, like, wasn't actually being protected. Like, who were they protecting by not giving their information to the author to be interviewed? Were they protecting the student, or were they protecting themselves from what the student might say about their experience as a minority student in these AP and honors track courses? So being given this gifted label gave people an advantage that reproduced social inequality. So once someone was given that label, it didn't really matter how much they performed or how well they actually performed in their classes. They were still considered gifted and still given the privileges of the other gifted students. So the final couple of things we looked at this week, I chose Netta Magbula's book, and that chapter from the book, because I think that it really highlights the ways that race is socially constructed, right? It's focusing on Iranian Americans. Um, and I think that when we're in the US context, we tend to think of race as the sort of black white divide. And that's a really important distinction and like really important concept to think about. But race and racial formation in the US is much, much more complicated than that, right? There are groups of people from all different continents and countries in the US. And so it's a lot more of a convoluted social process where race is being sort of both socially and legally constructed, and which I think is pretty obvious in the case of this chapter, right? Iranian Americans are considered legally white but socially brown, so they are given access to becoming citizens in the U.S. In the early 1900s, but at the same time they're experiencing a lot of racism. That's why I also assigned the 1700% slam poem video, because that's actually a video that Professor Magmula assigned when I took a class with her as an undergraduate while she was actually working on this book. It was a Middle Eastern Americans class, and she showed it to us, and I thought that it was like incredibly powerful, right? Because it shows how people who are one race are perceived to be something completely different, and how that actually has huge consequences, like to the point where people are being murdered because they're thought of as being Muslim or as Middle Eastern. And so it really highlights the ways that context matters for how we define and think about race and racial categories, especially when we think about the different forms of overt and covert racism. So the housing restrictions in Los Angeles that Netta highlights really are one of the more subtle ways, whereas the 1700% Project really highlights the individuals that Middle Easterners and Muslims face in the U.S. following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. I hope that these readings were a good combination to sort of both get across the way that social construction happens, but also how it happens differently for different groups of people, and how there can often be sort of a breakdown between legal race, social race, cultural race, and how those things work together to create unique experiences for people who belong to different racial categories. Feel free to email me with any questions or concerns, or send me an email if you want to have office hours. We can schedule a time to talk on the phone or Skype, whatever you're more comfortable with. I hope you all have a great rest of your week.